I certainly don't have as many slides as Jim did, but of course I don't have as much time. I'm going to talk about a project. Oops, wrong button there. There we go. I'm going to talk about a project called Sugar. It's a project about computer-aided design for MEMS, and I'm just going to give an overview. It's a very large project. It involves a whole number of faculty. Jim Demmel and myself, Alice Agugino in the mechanical engineering department. Chris Piester actually started this project many years ago out of a need that he had in designing MEMS devices. Recently we started working quite a bit with Roger Howe, and we've also worked with Xiaojun Bai at computer science department in Davis. So let me just first state what the objective of our project here is. Our project, in sort of a very brief statement, is to be SPICE to the MEMS world. So SPICE is an enormously successful methodology for doing circuit design, and we would like to develop something like that for the design of MEMS devices. Currently, primarily designers do things by hand on pencil and paper, and there are, of course, commercial design tools, but they tend often to be quite difficult to use. And we're also trying to advance development much more quickly by being an open source project where people around the world can interact and help develop this. But we also want to be a little bit more than what a traditional SPICE type of design program is. We're not only interested in simulation of devices, we're also interested in coupling this to design of devices directly and coupling that to measurement and then back through a feedback loop into design. And we want to do this very quickly, simply, and be quite capable to handle a large range of different types of devices. So the project involves design elements, design optimization elements. It involves items to do with quick simulation. It also has to do with tools to be able to do measurements that are coupled to the simulation, to have feedback between those two things, and then produce data that can feed back into the design cycle. And we can complete this loop forward and backwards in any direction that we'd like to go. Primarily for now, we have been looking at structural level MEMS devices, devices that are primarily fabricated in the MUMPS process, but we're starting to work on other newer processes as we're going along. Here. So the basic Sugar system, it looks somewhat like this in schematic form. It starts with a hierarchical scripting language where you can define your device in a parameterized way. So this is a very convenient way for defining what you're trying to simulate. The main engine for Sugar is a set of solvers for the mathematical equations and routines that assemble the equations, and also a whole collection of models for things like comb drives and suspensions and anchors and other types of common elements that you find in MEMS devices. We have both a MATLAB interface and a web interface. Most of the guts are written in C for speed. But we have these two interfaces, and then for a while we actually had an open interface running on a web page where anybody in the world could just upload their device and simulate it, and it would be spawned off onto our large Millennium computing cluster. The types of analysis that it does right now are things like transient analysis, steady state analysis. It'll do static analysis of MEMS devices, and we also have hooks for doing sensitivity analysis, which is very important for design types of things. And importantly, inside this box and around it, we also have design routines for doing different types of optimization. So you can optimize various performance parameters that you're interested in. And we also have Professor Bai has done a lot of work on model reductions to make this whole thing go very quickly. Let's see. I'm not sure where this thing is supposed to point. There we go. Did I go too far? There. Okay. So let me just say a few words about the challenges that arise in trying to do this. First of all, MEMS devices involve many different types of energy domains. There's the electrical domain where you drive the devices. Many of these devices operate through mechanical principles simply because it's much more efficient to process signals through mechanical vibrations than through electrons. And then there's also a thermal effect that quite often comes into place. And so you have very different energy domains, which makes the equations quite difficult to solve. There's a lot of questions about the accuracy of the models that are available, and also there's a lot of uncertainty when you go out to fabrication. What you get back is quite often not what you asked for. And so we try and incorporate all these elements inside the system. We typically end up with very large sparse systems of equations, and we have a couple ways of dealing with this. We could just simply deal with it through parallel computing, or we can also go to automatic order reduction of the models into dense systems of equations that are quite small, and I'll show some examples of that and how well that does actually work. So we've been using Krylov techniques to do that. So this is just an example of actually that last point. This is a a torsional micro mirror designed by Matt Last here. This little mirror right, oops, keep pushing the wrong button. Okay. This mirror right here in the center is meant to deflect optical signals. And this set of beam-looking type structures here are actually an array of comb drives that are being modeled explicitly in this through some of our models. And then there are suspension arms here that support this device. Just this little single piece with one little mirror here has about 10,000 degrees of freedom in it. And using some of our technology, we can figure out what the frequency response of this whole thing is over a range of interest in about 30 seconds. We can do it rather quickly. And that's quite important because if you think about what you want to do with these things is, for instance, for the projector, you'd like to have thousands of these things, tens of thousands of them, sitting in a vast array. And you'd like to be able to simulate the dynamics of this thing rather quickly when you're doing the design. And so the reduced order modeling methodologies that we've developed allow us to be able to do these types of calculations. Okay, so that's just one example of the reduced order modeling. I'll show another one in a little bit. But let me just say a little bit about design synthesis here. So we have a tool here that allows us to do simulation, but simulation only goes so far because it can only deal with the input that you give it. And so what we're also interested in is being able to optimize designs, to create designs that the designers have not thought about in the past. And so we've looked at, or looking at multi-objective genetic algorithms, combinatorial type problems used, and then we're also looking at specialized gradient methods for if we have continuous problems of a very particular nature. So the genetic algorithms allow us to get much wider variety of designs just simply by the way they work through genetic modeling. And the gradient type models are used on things where you maybe know a little bit more about what you'd like to have, and you just want to fine-tune some parameters. This is an example of the genetic algorithms work. This was done primarily by Alice Agogino and some of her students, Rafi Kemin in particular. And in this example here, what they started with was a set of building blocks, 4 anchors, a proof mass, and a couple of suspension arms. And they simply said that they wanted to optimize this device for frequency response and horizontal and vertical stiffness of the device. So it's a very simple type of problem. But they just simply started with some very basic building blocks. And here are some outputs of the genetic algorithm here under various types of conditions for the analysis. So here they just simply said, well, create the resonator. And this is one of the resonators that created this crazy-looking spire thing. And these are some comb drives here that it puts into the system. You can make things look a little bit more sensible in terms of what sort of an ordinary human would create by putting in some constraints of, say, symmetry from left to right. You get some things that look like this. Or you could say, well, no, I only want to deal with Manhattan geometry because I don't want to have crazy masks when I go to fab. And you can get something that looks like this. So you have a lot of variety of things that you can get. And you can get a lot of other types of devices out of this by including in your design space other types of building blocks. But you just don't know how to put them in. You just put them into the design algorithm, and you can let it help you out. Okay. This is an example of some very recent work that we've started. We actually, last week, put in a grant to NSF with Professor Demmel and Roger Howe on devices of this type. This is a Lemay resonator, and these are devices that are used in signal processing. One of the things that you find out when you get to very high frequencies is that it's much more efficient to do signal processing through mechanical means. And this is a mechanical resonator, and the way this device works, it's supposed to work as a frequency filter, actually. This plate over here and this one here are driven by some electrostatic drives, and they launch actually mechanical acoustical waves in these little plates here, and they run through these connecting beams. And by adjusting this configuration of these devices, you can actually process signals. And it's a very similar idea to what's done with SAW devices, surface acoustic wave devices. But what happens when you get into the very high frequency range and down to these low scales, you find out, for instance, that all that technology doesn't really work. For SAW devices, all the energy has to live in a little band of material that is about 1 micron thick. You have to be able to have something that is actually many times thicker than that if you would like to have that type of device. But we want to design devices that are on the micron scale and less to be able to push into these very high frequencies. So if you want to get into the gigahertz range, the length of these things can only be about 10 microns at maximum. So we're talking about very short devices. And the process layers are also quite thin in a lot of these processes here. And designing these things is very complicated. You drive these things, but then what you find out is when you sense at the other end that you find no signal. because the signal gets lost someplace. It gets trapped in very complicated acousto-mechanical physics in the edges of these things. It goes through the anchors into the substrate, and you never see it again. You get all sorts of crazy waveguide effects, just like you get in optics and electronics. They also happen here in the mechanics. And these things are very exciting because they can be used as frequency references. They can be used for signal processing. You can actually do computation with these things if you hook them up together properly using neural networks. And they're also extremely low power. So there are a lot of nice things about them, but they're enormously difficult to design. If you look in the literature, people make these things, and quite often they get better results from the devices they fabricated, devices that sometimes are broken. They'll come back, some of the suspension arms will be broken, and the thing will work better than they thought it was going to work originally with the suspension intact. And so it's an extremely complicated design problem, and it involves, with reference to sugar, going to things well beyond sort of the standard structural vibration type elements in MEMS devices, because we have to deal with continuum wave propagation in these things. And we're trying to build this technology currently into sugar to be able to deal with these things and predict what the response will be. Just to show a little bit, these are just some very rough calculations omitting many of the physics, but this gives an idea what these things do. You drive them electrically at one side, and then they just start to vibrate. And these are some of the vibration modes of these things. And then you can pick off the vibration at the other side and continue with your signal processing. And we'd like to be able to optimize these things. And this design was, in concept, supposed to be a bandpass filter. And we tried to optimize it by trying to optimize the size of those little square plates and the linkages. This is an example of a Bode plot of that system that you saw on the other page. And one of the things I want to point out here is that we did a full analysis of this, and these are just some timing runs on the Sun machine here. And if you do a full timing run to generate this Bode plot, it takes about 1,500 seconds. But if we use our reduced order modeling methodologies, we can get this down to 28 seconds. So we can really save time and do quite well. And you can see that the two curves lie exactly on top of each other. So we can do this extremely accurately and quickly when we want to. And this has been done with a Krylov technique. Okay, now let me move on, not to use too much time here. Let me talk a little bit about experimental measurements. So we can do modeling, we can do simulation, but obviously we want to make real devices and make them work and improve real things. And so what we need to do is experimental measurements. And so we're trying to develop an integrated modeling and testing. That's really the ideal type of thing. And we want a tight coupling. So testing, you get automatic extraction from the test machine about what you're actually testing. It will create the model for you, simulate that model, and you can try and then compare the two things and maybe have a little feedback loop going. These are some of Rafi's spider resonators. It's a little bit hard to see, but these bright things are the bonding pads here. They're comb drives, and here are some of these suspension arms. So these were devices that came out of the genetic algorithm, automatically created the CIF files from the analysis using the netlist, and they're sent off to the lab, and this is the chip that came back for testing here. And so we have that. So I went to the foundry and came back. And then we went in and we started doing measurements on these things, and these are some static measurements. This is a device over here, actually. That's a probe tip and a probe station. The graduate students just pushing on the things there. And all these little red dots are automatically sensed by our software. So what the software that we have here will do also is you can put your device in a machine. In this case, it's optical. It'll try and pick off the features of this thing, sense the data. It generates the parameters for actually the simulation software. And this is actually a rendering from the simulation software itself. And this corresponding red dots are shown here. So that's actually an automatic step there. It'll simulate it. And in the middle here, you actually have this picture and this picture superimposed on each other. So we can actually do the comparison. And if the comparison doesn't work out well, we can then go back and refine the parameters in here. And we can also do parameter extraction of this system. So this worked very nicely. This was the static case here. Of course, one of the things we're interested quite a bit in are these resonator types of devices for doing the processing that I showed you, for instance, that Lemay resonator that we were looking at. This is what you're looking at here are some fringe patterns, and embedded in these fringe patterns are supposed to be a MEMS gyroscope in here, designed by Sunil Bava. And you can see, or maybe appreciate a little bit about the difficulty of actually doing this. You stick this thing in the machine, and you're looking at this, and you have to figure out where the device is in this thing, and the table maybe is tilted. This thing is supposed to be oscillating, so it's moving around very quickly, and you have to be able to extract all these little small features which are very hard to see with your eye, and it's not because the slide is bad, it's just because the image that you get is not particularly great. And so part of what we've worked on is an interface that allows you to do this. This is in the SMIS machine, which is over in Corey Hall, and we've actually worked on a remote set of software where you can actually put these devices in these types of machines because there aren't many of them, and so they could be off-site someplace, and you can actually remotely control the machine, collect your data remotely through an interface, and do the processing. And so there's a lot of challenges here in capturing the device, processing the image, trying to figure out what the error metrics are, and things of that nature. Okay, so that's a brief overview of some of the things that we're doing, but it's a large project. You saw the large number of faculty that are involved in this. So let me just say a few other things about what are going on in the project. We're working on technology to provide bounding sets for expected performance. So if you design a device and you simulate it, we'd like to also be able to tell you, well, if you have these process variations, you can expect that your performance parameters will rely on some sort of set, and we'd like to be able to tightly bound that set. So we've been working on that. I mentioned already this issue of these resonating devices like the LeMay resonator for gigahertz signal processing. And there are a lot of really cool physics in this. Is one of my main areas of research is about the thermoelastic damping and the radiation damping that comes from these types of devices. I said a few words about the material parameter extraction. We started recently working on new models for the system to start to be able to support newer processes like silicon germanium processes, single crystal silicon processes, also trying to figure out how to handle the CMOS layer. So we have electrical elements in our simulation software, but we're looking at also putting in CMOS type things. We're also working on reduced order models to handle different types of drives that you can drive these devices with. And so directly going from the EM field equations down into reduced order models. Real-time dynamic experimental simulation. The last slide showed a little bit about that. That project is still in its infancy in some ways. And we're continuing to work on sort of advanced design synthesis and optimization technologies, both the continuous and the combinatorial type of things. Let me close with some of the names of some of the students that have worked on this. This is the Sugar Bat. This was designed by David Germeyer here, who does a lot of the image processing work for us. David Bindle, computer science. Jason Clark, applied science and technology. David Germeyer from computer science. Rafi Kamelin from ME did the genetic algorithm work. Tsuyoshi Koyama from civil engineering is working on the resonators. Shyam Lakshman, computer science, and Jaiwang Ni from math, who's been doing a lot of the continuous optimization. So I will stop there. I think I'm on time.
Any questions about this very interesting project? Tough problems. Tough problems. Yes?
I'm really afraid no single human designer can cover all necessary knowledge of this kind of sugar. The question is, sugar itself could be a kind of foundation for collaboration among different background engineers. So do you have some
thoughts on that? Well, you'll notice here, for instance, that the departments from which the students come from are very varied, as are the faculty. And so this is actually one of the bigger challenges of doing this type of project, is actually getting all these different people to talk to each other and understand what they're doing. And so we work hard on education. So we have long weekly meetings with mini tutorials and things like that, where we try and help students. And part of the goal here is to educate individuals that are broadly trained that can handle this type of thing.
we find, let's see, kind of background foundation for these different backgrounds?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear because the door was banged.
So far, do you find any specific, common foundation for those?
Oh, in other words, what can you train them in that's sort of common? I'm not sure that we've really hit upon that entirely. But, okay, yeah, I should mention EE245, which we usually require all of these students, or we strongly encourage them, because we try not to be too heavy-handed. But we encourage all of these students to take EE245, which is the basic MEMS design course, which covers things like electronics and mechanics and a lot of things in an overview sense. And then when they come here, we try and give them more specifics if they join the project. But you do need one broad course.
Why don't we see any EE student here?
Why don't we see any EE students? Let's see, do we have any?
There are users.
There are users. Sunil Bhavav's name was up there, and he's actually interacted quite a bit with us. And the mechanical engineering students have a lot of crossover training in this type of device, this type of technology. And our collaboration with Roger Howe has just started to get off the ground, so I expect to have more EE students in the project.
Great. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you very much.